Okay, so moving on to Lapis Lazuli snare drum and such. I again already went into what a compressor does, and we have yet another compressor, but this has an EQ as well, so I can kind of go over it together. I like using this. This is called the British channel. It's from IK Multimedia's T-Rax. I like using this. You can use the same settings on any equalizers, the same settings on any compressor. Do not worry about it. I just like using this because it's modeled after something that provides a certain sound to it, and, whatever. It looks weird, but, this also acts as a way for you to get familiar with the different ways that a compressor can look depending on what you have going. So let me move on here. So basically with the snare drum, and again, this is a pre-processed snare, so you may have to do it, but the key points are, you don't want too much, and sometimes a snare drum will need more of it. If I recall correctly, this was set a little bit differently based on things. But we have only about like 1.2 because this snare I was using had a lot of thwack to it. So that's around 300 hertz. That's where the beef of a snare drum is. That's where some muddiness can occur. If your snare sounding kind of thin, experiment with around 300 hertz or so. And, this is a pretty thin cue, but you can do it more. I prefer to be a bit more precise with my snare drums because snare drums are a weird sound. There's a lot going on, and there's not a note that you need to worry about. So you can go a little thinner. But this is even still a little bit wide. So just keep an eye if you have a graphical EQ where you can see the wave, like on the kick drum. That way you can just kind of be as wide as possible with it. That's where you want to err when you're doing stuff like this, unless there's like a specific frequency you just want to go to. And generally speaking, you don't need to do that. And then the spot where you get a lot of the crispness of a snare, oops, probably should solo it. That part of the snare is around 3 kilohertz. So you want to boost that a little bit. Be careful though, this is where a lot of stuff is happening. Like the guitar crunch is just below this at 2K, and vocals like to sit just above this, like with the presence of a vocal at 4K. So you just want to make sure you're careful. Use a pretty wide cue, and then sweep around because different snare drums have different points. Sweeping around, by the way, I mean like just go like crank this and go and see what where the sound changes. If you can do that with whatever DAW you're using. Again, I'm using Cakewalk Sonar, but if you have something like Audacity, you basically have to go make a setting, write it down, and then apply it, and then go from there. If you have a preview, even better, but still. I probably don't need to do this for this snare drum, but this snare drum is great because it makes the top and the bottom of the snare, which is a popular technique, and it captures the bottom of the snare, sometimes gets some of the kick drum, and I don't want any of that in there. This is pre-processed, but I don't trust it necessarily, so I want to make sure that I get the best thing possible, and just cut out 80 hertz. The snare drum in this particular style and the way I like a snare to sound does not have anything going on below 85, so you have that filter on there. And if for some reason it's capturing some cymbals, you can cut out some of the high end, but generally speaking, you don't want to do that. That snare needs to snap through. All right, so this is a fast attack. As mentioned, you want to have a fast attack on your compressor when you're compressing drums. This one has a threshold, so that means anything that's peaking past -11, which this generally does, will get compressed, and I have this at a 4 ratio. The knee is how hard it applies the ratio. That's something that wasn't on the other compressor, but it's got a knee. Harder knees are more like limiters where they just, but softer knees to the compressor, and I think they call it that because it's a curve, is a softer knee would just be like it doesn't hit the wall as hard. So once this goes over -11, boom, down to 4. That's what a hard knee does. But when it doesn't do that when it's not a hard knee. So it sort of has a bit more to it. So this also has the drive thing. Again, don't need to do too much at the end because this is at a -, you can adjust either one. And I have this like this because through the idiosyncrasies of this sampler, it always, once I freeze it into where you can see the wavelengths, it always sounds louder for some reason. and it reads as louder, so I just hedge my bets. You can always turn it up in the mix, to be honest with you. When you're working with sample sets, if they're good, you don't really have to worry too much about where the sound is coming from. Rather, you don't have to worry about like hisses and hums and all that. Not always the case. Again, if you're working with live, that's a different story. But with this, you know, if you have good sample set, like I'm using Easy Drummer, it works that way. And again, yeah, pretty quick release. This is 5 milliseconds. Doop doop. Or, you know, actually, this is 500 milliseconds. I guess I have a little bit of a less of a curve here. I could probably do this some more, but I don't like an overcompressed snare, and I tend to doctor my snares a little bit more. But if you need more, definitely just bring it down. All right, so that's that. And that covers actually both the EQ and the compression for the snare drum. Again, have it sending to the fattener. This bus, by the way, this fattener bus is important to note that it is, it is mono. So you want to make sure it's a mono bus, because for the kick drum and the bass drum, there's no reason to have, in this style, any low end on the sides. It just basically should try to be in the center as much as possible. And so that's what monoizing helps do. And you don't want to do that on a bass track, generally speaking, right? Like a standard track. But if you have a bunch of mono tracks going into fattener, just make it mono. It usually saves on CPU power and helps you just do that more easily. And if there's any, like if it's a stereo signal or for something weird like that, you can work with it. Additionally, to note about it, it's got the compressor there. It's all of these are fader, meaning this has -15 on the volume, or you can probably see it a little bit better over here. So it's -15.8. That basically, this doesn't apply when you have it pre-fader. So that means that it's just going full bore into the fattener. And so you can use this level to kind of adjust it, because sometimes like that means like just the natural signal, the snare is going to be hecka loud. And you don't want that. You want to make sure it's as quiet as possible. So, you know, just not quiet as possible, but it's well mixed, I suppose. So let me see here. The funny thing is with hats is you don't usually have to do too much to them. If anything, I'm just going to do a quick overview because I don't really do too much to the rest of these. If for hi-hats, you know, usually if you're working in a live environment, you're getting them from the overheads, which is the cymbals. And that means that you don't really have too much control over it. But if you do, don't really need a lot. Pan it. I like to pan it to the right. Some people pan it to the left. I don't understand the difference. And so definitely, you know, think about that. If it needs anything, I would boost around, you know, some sizzle around 10 kilohertz. I don't need to boost these hi-hats at all. They're very sizzly as it is. Same thing for these toms. I'm going to show you the basic curve for like a tom is basically a U, because you don't, in this style, want a lot of mid-range in them. And the attack is around, let me just pull up an EQ so you can see it. The attack for a tom, here we go, is around 6 for the high toms. Let me see, 3 for the mid toms, and then 2 for the high toms. It's just where you get the nice punch through. And then you want to control where the low end hits. Like I just did this because I had a lot going on in that 200 Hertz area. So for toms, adjust them as you can if you have them mic'd. Always pan them. Basically starting with the high ends to the left and then moving over to the right as they go around. Sometimes you only have 3, therefore it's just like boom, 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 where my mouse was hitting. So like, you know, halfway to the left, most of the way to the right, most of the way to the right. You know, so that's how that goes with the toms. And so, I mean, that's basic panning for the toms. Depending on if you're doing something really crazy, I don't usually, but if you're like really going super arena rock 80s, you can put some reverb on the tom. You can put them through this snare reverb, which I forgot to talk about actually. So yeah, to help the snare stick out a bit, you want some reverb on the snare, and it basically, oh, I did have them through. I didn't know that. Oh, I have them soloed. Yeah, so. Yeah, so it's just a small reverb. Helps it stick out a little bit, because otherwise the snare's really clean. Most snares are really close mic'd. You don't always need a lot of that. It depends. Moving more forward. So we got the toms. We talked about that. Room mics are a typical thing, because that way you can capture the whole drum kit, and it basically just adds aliveness to it. I mean, that's just really from the room. The snare always sticks out more, you know, and you always just want to keep that in mind. It's a good way to add reverb, so you don't have to do too much snare verb. It just adds a certain liveness to it. Oh. And and for the overheads, if you want to add some more sparkle, 10 kilohertz. Be careful though, cymbals can get really irritating sounding if you EQ them too much. I like to leave them alone as much as possible, except, if they're, usually what you'll have is, and you have a setting in this sampler, and I'm a cheater, but for a lot of overheads, unless you have some really crazy miking, it'll pick up everything else. Like, it'll sound like this almost, but a little bit more centered on the cymbals. And so what you want to make sure you do is just cut out all the low end that you don't need. You don't need anything below 300 hertz on overheads. And you don't need it, much below. You don't want to do one of the basic, like, EQs like that, basically, for room as well. Don't need any of the extreme. This is just to fill out the sound a little bit, so it sounds more like a real drummer in a drum kit, and more like, you're not... It helps it not sound as sterile, so it sounds like there's a band playing together. And that's really what you want to do as much as possible. So, and that's the way the drums sound when they're just soloed. So it only took 2 episodes of Lapis Lazuli, but I hope that gives you a good idea of how to start with drums. A lot of it's trial and error, and again, I didn't do a lot of EQ for this song because it didn't need it, but recently I released my Giant Woman track. I needed to add some high ends of the overheads. I was using the same setup, and to the hi-hats to make them stick through just a little bit, and but everything else I basically did the same way. So I hope that gives you a good starting point on what to do for drums. If you have any questions about where to look for certain samples, or if you have any questions relating to drums, please comment on this video, and I will definitely try to address them as much as possible. I'm always open to listening to mixes when I can, so let me know. And if you think I did anything horribly wrong, well, again, let me know in the comments section below. Otherwise, thank you for sitting through 2 sections of drums. I probably... Again, I'm a very minimalist kind of guy, so this is a very minimalist approach to drums. There's people who probably screw with their drums even more, and if not using pre-processed samples, I'll go through that on another day though. But this is sampled drums, and this is Cyril the Wolf, to you, the Wolf Pack, signing out. Thank you for watching me. Check out all my drum tracks